In the last video, we talked about the if statements and how they work in conjunction with Boolean data types to determine whether or not code inside of the if statement's body gets executed or not. So just to recap, when you declare an if statement, you also declare a parameter argument. And in that parameter argument, you need to specify a variable, and depending on whether or not that variable is true, the code inside of the if statement's body gets executed. So in this case, we have an if statement on line 8, and inside of its arguments, we have one variable, a Boolean variable. And a Boolean will only ever hold the value of true or false. In this case, we're letting it keep the value of true. So this reads, if it is raining outside, then print out wear a raincoat. And if this is false, Java will just skip this completely. It won't run what's inside of the statement because this variable has returned the value false. So it doesn't execute the code inside of the if statement's body. So just to run through this example, let's keep it at true. And when you're working with Booleans, it's proper convention to name your variables with is, starting with is. So this could be maybe like renamed to is raining outside, just so that when you read it in an if statement, it reads kind of like English. So for example, here, if it is raining outside, you understand pretty quickly that, this line of code only gets executed if it is raining outside. And it is raining outside gets determined by what the value of this variable is. So in this case, we have a couple of print statements. One print statement gets printed out before the if statement, just to tell us that, we're about to go into the if statement. And one print statement gets printed out after the if statement gets checked, just to notify us that we have already checked the if statement and the program is finishing up. And we have, of course, one other print statement that either gets printed out when this variable is true. In this case, it was, and so it did print out as expected. But if this is false, it shouldn't get printed out, because if this is false, if the arguments inside of the if statement are false, the code inside of the if statement's body gets ignored. And it did in this case too, because, it did in this case because the variable it is raining outside is false. Okay. So now in this video, we're going to talk about some additional arguments that you can pass in an if conditional. So this here, what we've been calling parameter arguments are really they're also called conditionals. And so they're called conditionals because depending on what the value of this variable is, it will execute the code inside of the if statement. So the if statement will only execute on the condition that this variable is true. So what else can we do inside of if statement conditionals? Well, the conditional doesn't always have to be a Boolean variable. What you can do is, let's delete the Boolean conditional here. And what we can do is we can use less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to determine whether or not the line of code or the lines of code, because you can have multiple lines of code inside of your if statement, executes. So you don't need to have this be a Boolean variable that determines whether or not the if statement's body gets executed. You can have some different kinds of conditionals that use these mathematical symbols um, to trigger the code inside of the if statement's body. So to give you an example, let's work with integers and strings too, but let's focus on integers first. So like I mentioned, we can use the less than sign, the greater than sign. This here is the less than or equal to sign, which is just the less than sign with the equal to sign kind of merged together without a space. This here is the greater than or equal to sign, which is kind of like the less than and equal to sign, just the greater than sign with the equal sign merged together with no space in between. And this here is the equals um, or equal to sign or symbol. It's just two consecutive equals signs. So we'll talk about this a little more in depth, but just take note that it's not the same thing as just a single equal sign, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So on line 5 and on line 6, we have two integer variables. One is called number 1, and it holds a value of 100. And on line 6, we have another integer variable called number 2, and it holds a value of 200. So we're going to modify the if statement on line 13. And we're going to ask it to evaluate whether or not number 1 is less than number 2. Okay? So what we're doing here on line 13 is we're asking Java, when it runs our code, we're asking it to say, or to ask itself, is number 1 less than number 2? Okay? Is the value of number 1, which is 100, less than number 2? And if it is, if this evaluates to yes, if this is true, if number 1 is in fact less than number 2, then only then execute this line of code. Okay, so I'm going to change this actually to read number 1 is less than number 2, right? And I'm going to run that now. So let's give it a second. Okay, great. So so we successfully printed out the if statement before, the print statement before the if statement and the print statement after the if statement, right? So this is before and this is after. And we also printed out we also got the number 1 is less than number 2 message printed out. And that was because inside of the if statement conditional, this evaluated to true. So this was true. Number 1, the value of number 1, which is 100, was in fact less than the value of number 2, which is 200. So 100 is less than 200. So this whole thing evaluated to true. So as you can see, you don't need to have a Boolean variable determining whether or not your attribute or your if statement is true or false. You can have mathematical calculations be taken place to kind of determine whether or not this block of code gets run or not. And the same thing applies to the greater than sign. So we talked about the less than sign. And now let's look at the greater than sign. So let's ask it, is number 1 greater than number 2? And if it is, if number 1 is greater than number 2, then this line of code will execute. And we see that it did not execute. And that's because number 1 is not greater than number 2. That's because number 1 is 100 and number 2 is 200, and 100 is not greater than 200. So this, so in here, Java asks itself, is 100 greater than 200? The answer was no. So this returned false. So since this if conditional returned false, this line of code did not execute because the conditional was false. Okay, so now let's look at less than or equal to. So less than or equal to is really it evaluates two numbers, um, and it'll return true if the expression is, you know, the number on the left is less than or equal to the number on the right. So let's do less than or equal to as the conditional operator here, and let's run this. So this will evaluate true if number one is less than or equal to number two. And it returned true because number one, again, is 100, and it is less than or equal to 200. So just to kind of prove that it's slightly different from the less than operator, well, I'm going to change number one to be the same value as number two. So in this case, this whole thing evaluates to true because now number one is equal to number two, right? So if I change number one to 201, now it wouldn't evaluate to true because number one is greater than number two. Great, as you can see there. So now let's look at greater than or equal to number two. So now we're going to ask ourselves, is number one greater than or equal to number two? And number one right now is 201, and number two is 200. So this should evaluate to true because number one is greater than number two. And there it is. So I'm not gonna bother with changing the message here. Again, just in the interest of time, but you'll see the whole point is just like for you to see that the conditional is determining whether or not this line of code gets executed or not, and it's doing it correctly. So now, so we covered the less than symbol in the conditional, right? So for the less than symbol, the number on the left has to be less than the number on the right in order for the whole expression to return true and then trigger the code inside of the body. And for the greater than symbol, the number on the left has to be greater than the number on the right for it to trigger the code inside of the body. Similarly, with the less than or equal to symbol, the number on the left has to be less than or equal to the number on the right in order to have this entire expression evaluate to true and then trigger this line of code. And the same thing with the greater than or equal to symbol. Now let's look at the equals symbol. So this is called the equality operator. Let me write that down. So equality operator. So equality is different from just a single equals sign because so the equality operator has two consecutive equals symbols without a space in between. And what's the difference between two equal signs and just one? So if you notice here, and if you remember from like all the other different data types that we've covered in the past videos, whenever we create a new variable, we're assigning it a value right off the bat as soon as we create it. So here, for example, on line 5, we have a new integer variable. We called it number 1, and we gave it the value, or we assigned it the value of 201. On line 6, we have another integer variable. We called it number 2, and we assigned it the value of 200. So in an if statement, in the conditional, you want to also be able to compare the values of two variables. So for example, here, number 1 and number 2, right? We're using these two to compare whether or not they're greater than or equal to each other. And if they are, then if number 1 is greater than or equal to number 2, this whole thing evaluates to true, and this line of code gets executed. But what if we want to just compare for equality? What if we want to say Is number one the exact same value as number two? Well, you wouldn't do this because what this does is it takes number one and it assigns it the value of number two. So in essence, what we're doing is we're taking number one, we're making it equal to number two. So in this case, what we're doing here is just taking the value of number two, whatever it is, in this case it's 200, and storing that in number one. So we're overwriting this value with this value. And that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is compare them. So the way to compare two variables together to check whether or not they are the same thing, whether or not they're the same value, is to use the double equal sign, which is called the equality operator. And you can use that in an if statement to compare whether or not two different variables hold the exact same value. Okay, so here now we have on line 14, we're checking if number one is equal to number two. In other words, if the variable number one holds the exact same value as the variable number two, then this whole thing evaluates to true, and this line of code gets executed. So let's run this and see what we get. So this should evaluate to false. This conditional should evaluate to false because number one holds the value of 201 and number two holds the value of 200. So 201 is not equal to 200. So this whole thing returns false. And so this does not get executed. And that's exactly what we see in the console. We see the message before the if statement, which is here, and we see the message after the if statement, which gets a output after the conditional gets checked here. So this will evaluate to true only when these two variables are equal. Okay, when they're the same, when they hold the same value. So let's do that. Let's change number one from 201 to 200 so it matches the value of number two. So now when our code executes line 14, when we enter the if statement's conditional, number one is checked against number two for comparison. We're looking at the equality of them. We're looking at whether or not they hold the same value. In this case, they do, because number one holds a value of 200, and number two holds a value of 202. So this equality operator checks the value of number one and the value of number two, and it asks itself, are they equal? Are they the same number? And this returns true because they are. So we end up with the value of true in the conditional, and this line of code gets executed. And yep, that's exactly what happens. The print statement prints out. So now one last thing is, how do we use these operators with string variables? And actually, before we talk about that, in this example, we're using integers, but we could just as well use double variables with these operators. So they'll work exactly the same way. You can use the less than, greater than, less than or equal to, or the greater than or equal to, as well as the equality operator with double variables. It doesn't matter. The operators will perform the exact same way. Now, looking at strings, though, is where you have a bit of a difference. So the less than, greater than, less than or equal to, and greater than or equal to operators will not work with string variables. And it makes sense because the less than operator, the greater than operator, the less than or equal to operator, and the greater than or equal to operator are intended to be used with numbers, not with strings. You can't really ask yourself, is one string less than another string. It doesn't make any sense. But what you can ask yourself is, are they equal? Do they hold the same value? Do they hold the same string? So let's look at that in action here. So let's replace number 1 and number 2 on line 14 with string 1. Oops. String 1 and string 2. So what are we doing here? We're taking, I'm going to change this strings are equal. So all we're doing here, we're taking the two strings, string 1 and string 2, and we're comparing them. We're having Java ask itself, are the values of these two strings the same thing? So we're comparing string 1, which holds the value Vienna, and string 2, which holds the value Houston. So if we run that, this expression should return false because string 1 does not match the value of string 2. But let's change that. Let's change this string 2 variable to hold Vienna. And if we run that again, we get the message that the strings are equal because string 1 matched the value of string 2, which then triggered line 15 and printed out that print statement. But again, be careful with the spelling of your strings because, again, most programmers make the mistake of thinking that the capitalization of your strings does not matter. It does. So this will return false because string 1 does not match string 2 because there's a capitalization error on the second string. So just keep that in mind. You can only use the equality operator. Well, you can use the equality operator on any kind of data type, but you are limited to only being able to use these 4 less than or equal, less than, greater than, less than or equal to, and greater than or equal to operators on numeric data types.